Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Jim Moore, it's great to chat with you again. Welcome back to, I guess this is our 5th edition of the Apollo Case Study Series. How's it going?
That's right. It's going great. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. So I think we just spent the last half hour talking about a wide range of issues, including our favorite drummers and all sorts of things. So it's about time to get down to business and actually talk about behavior analysis.
That's right.
And some of the thoughts that are kind of percolating or swirling around that mind of yours. So I when we were talking about this topic, it really fascinated me. So I'm looking forward to getting into it. So I suppose well, you tell me what you would want to call this topic more generally. What to know about when switching or when contemplating switching clinical systems, or I don't know this.
What to do when things don't go as planned.
Okay. All right.
I think what I've seen in my years of consulting with clinics and mentoring young BCBAs is they'll put a lot of energy into their initial assessment, a lot of energy into getting initial treatment plans written, and so much excitement around, a new case or a new protocol, and then things don't go as you anticipate. And then what do you do? In the billing world, we have an entire code for BCBAs, 97155, that for short we call protocol modification. It's a chance for us to not only supervise our technician, but to make modifications to either how a system is implemented or change a protocol altogether. And that is a particular area I noticed years ago with young BCBAs in particular, that they'll go into that initial protocol or that initial case with a lot of excitement, but as soon as things don't seem to be working out, then they go into panic mode. And one of the things that I've really tried to impress upon our team is instead of going into panic mode, hey, this is actually not a bad thing. Part of science is failure. And from that failure, instead of panicking and letting kind of our emotions take over our decision-making process, we go back to those attitudes or those tools of science. And we figure out, in the very first episode, we talked about kind of our steps of scientific problem solving. Well, this in particular is when you've ruled out all the more parsimonious answers.
Okay.
And now you do have to make some change. And what kind of process do you use to go about that change?
All right. So I'm going to hold you right there just for a second, because there's a lot in that statement there. And so I want to make sure we kind of proceed through this slowly and deliberately, because you and I have had a lot of conversation on this, but I don't want to lose the audience along the way. So when we say protocol, that can include a bunch of different things, right? So that could be Absolutely. Like an assessment, like a VB map or a peak, or it could be a curriculum, like either peak or ACE or whatnot. Is that what you have in mind?
It can be a skill acquisition protocol. So like trying to teach a child manding or tacting or receptive identification. It can be an assessment protocol. It can be a behavior reduction protocol. It can be, what do you do when you run a functional analysis, and no matter what kind of conditions or what kind of approach you use, you don't get problem behavior in those conditions. What do you do? To sum it up in short, in my opinion, assessment never stops. Mm-hmm. It never stops. And we, as the behavior analysts, is kind of like when I'm leading a team, I'm kind of like the chief science officer of that team. I need to bring certain scientific attitudes and procedures to play in terms of decide to do what's next. Like a lot of people think, oh, you were a VB map person, now you're a peak person. So you just decided one day to switch. Maybe it was new or it's cool, or you and Mark Dixon are friends. No, actually, that's not the case at all. I had noticed long before Peak came out that for a number of my clients, I was having to supplement the VB map with other procedures, mostly those of my own invention, because I was just not getting into their full repertoire. And so when Peak came out, I put it through a critical analysis to see, am I getting more information? Am I getting, number one, I don't want to lose any of the information from my previous assessment that I do think is vital. So am I capturing that information, but am I now getting additional data that help me write better treatment plans?
One of the things I think that is perhaps different now than perhaps 10 years ago or so, there seems to be so many different shiny objects out there in the ABA marketplace. So if you go to any conference and you just wander through the booths, the vendor booths, and so there's a new curriculum for this, a new billing software system, a new digital data collection or data capture system, and we've talked about some of these systems on the show with various people, and there's a lot of great stuff that's coming out. So it's both perhaps a blessing and a curse. The upside, I suppose, is that we're getting all this innovation that hopefully will drive some better clinical decision making, some efficiency, better outcomes for learners and clients. At the same time, I have to imagine there's some risk of people just hopping from one platform to the next, thinking the new platform is going to solve their problems. So let's talk about that a little bit. So before starting the trial to the next, the next thing that they someone sees at a trade show booth. Let's talk about why someone might want to explore a different protocol, and maybe what some of those things are one can do before going there.
Sure. I think that to talk about assessment first, because that's a really important topic to me. I think the first step is, do you have a conceptually systematic approach to your assessment? Like, do you forget all the tools? What is it that you believe is important through the assessment process, whatever the referral concern may be? And then, going to the literature and seeing, okay, what tools out there seem to be adequate for whatever specific issue I'm assessing. We actually, my research team and I did that in 2019. We put out a paper looking at, number one, kind of what you said, what's all available? What could you go to the trade show and to the convention and see in terms of assessment? And we found 19 published assessments at that time in our field. But when we looked at which one of those assessments or which collection of those assessments actually have assessment data, meaning kind of the psychometric properties of these assessments, kind of like what you see in other fields with their assessment instruments. And we were really surprised to find only 2 at that time. There were other, like the VB map appeared in other studies, but not as a study on predictive validity or reliability, rate of reliability or anything like that. So we found that only the Early Start Denver model and the peak assessment actually had publications specifically looking at the psychometric properties of those assessment instruments. Well, that in and of itself is not enough. I always harken back to something I heard Wayne Fuqua say a few years ago, that evidence-based practice is not just the fact that what you're doing has a publication behind it. It's that you have used your clinical data and your clinical expertise to match your client's issues or your more systemic issue to something that has empirical evidence in the literature behind it. So I think the next step, rather than just saying, oh, great, okay, now let's order an EDSM and let's order a peak, and that's all we're doing. No. What are the problems you're assessing, and how well, when you put your own skeptical and critical analysis behind the tools you're using, how well or how good are those data? How useful are those data, and how much are those data informing your treatment? So you come in, usually in autism practice, you'll have this period where you have an approval to do your assessment, and then there's maybe a couple of weeks delay while you're getting the treatment plan approved. When that child comes back in and starts, are you finding that your initial programs, you're just kind of flying through those. Kid already can do all these things, which would suggest that maybe your assessment was filled with lots of false positives or actually false negatives, saying that it's not in the repertoire when it really is. Or are you seeing that as soon as you get in, wow, this child really can't do everything I assume they could do based on my assessment. So really kind of keeping your own clinical log of the quality of the assessment outcomes you're getting. And when you see, wow, our assessments, are they adding anything? Or are we having to start day one of treatment kind of starting over and figuring out what to actually do? And if they are not yielding productive treatment outcomes initially, and maybe your assessment looks like it's more perfunctory than really functional, it might be time to ask yourself, should we change? Should we look and see what else is out there? And listen, I understand that all of us have insurance requirements that we have to navigate in terms of assessment. But most of the payers I've seen allow us to have a little bit more open. For example, I have an assessment coming up later today that we'll do the complete peak comprehensive assessment with the child. We will do the early echoic assessment, early echoic skills assessment from the VB map. We will do parts of the early start Denver model. And we'll also do, because from what we can tell from the records, the child doesn't have vocal speech. So we'll also do methods of alternative speaking from Essentials for Living. All of that is kind of based on our triage of the assessment. Here's what we're going in with, but we're also based on what we see from the client once they get here. We're going to be prepared because we kind of have an entire conceptually systematic approach to assessment. Other things we may need to be ready to pull out to give us the best assessment outcomes we can get.
How non-tribal of you to mix and match those different systems. It's definitely refreshing to hear that. Certainly,
I'll tell you specifically on the alternative speakings assessment from Essentials for Living, which is very easy to do. There's even an online calculator you can use for that particular assessment. In today, what will often happen with a lot of our young learners that have no vocal speech is they may go to a speech language pathologist, and in terms of functional communication, like a big ticket treatment item right out the gate, speech language pathologist might recommend one thing. Like maybe they say we should use a device. The school says we don't want to use a device. We're going to use, PEX cards. And then we, as the behavior analysts, that assessment gives us the ability to say, well, based on what we know in research, but based on specific factors of this client, here is not just one, it rank orders. The online calculator ranks all of the methods of alternative speaking in rank order based on their benefits and specifics of the client. Like if they have fine motor issues, for example, a device might not be indicated for that particular, even though devices are all the rage. I've published a study in JABA on using devices to evoke vocal speech. But for this particular client, that might not be appropriate. And I find that particular assessment really gives us good information to give to the parent and to try and collaborate with everyone else who might be trying to tackle that problem.
All right. Pat McGreevy, that endorsement's on the house. The next one we'll have to talk about. So yeah. All kidding aside. So tell me, Jim, so, before you, kind of found your home at Apollo, you've mentioned this in the past. You've done the kind of, as we called it in the previous episodes, the Gordon Ramsay kitchen nightmare tour of clinics. And so you've noted some of these challenges when people are attempting to either take a hard look at the systems they're using or switching systems and things like that. So I think there's you've got a unique perspective on that. So can you tell me about some of the other challenges that you've seen when people are trying to, closely examine what they're doing, or even let's say they've made some sort of assessment that they need to move on to a different protocol of some sort. Can you talk about maybe some of the I guess do's and don'ts of undertaking a new clinical protocol system? Call it what you like.
Absolutely. So whether it's a large scale systemic change or whether it's a specific protocol change for a specific client, I've always been taught all the way back to my days in graduate school that before you invest a lot of energy and time into large scale change or even small scale change, you really should, use those steps that we talked about in episode 1. You have some hypotheses. You have some evidence to suggest that maybe things should go in a particular direction. Why not test run that? Why make such a full-scale, immediate change instead of saying, hey, I think that folks like Ed Daly and Chris Skinner and some of our friends from the academic side of behavior analysis have always advocated a great approach, which was, hey, why not test run? But also, why not, if you've got 2 or 3 options, why not test them all and really see empirically which, whether it's a systems change or whether it's an individual protocol change, which one of those are best? Like we talked in episode 1, too, that we have a unified clinical manual that kind of unifies all of our practices across all of our sites. We constantly use the data we collect around that, especially our universal tier 1 protocol, to keep asking ourselves, is this the best we can do? Because our value of philosophical doubt should inspire us to always say, what can we do better? Can't we do better than this? Some of the things that I see, again, when I've toured a lot of these clinics before the pandemic, the first thing I've noticed, especially with behavior reduction, is if the first thing they try doesn't work, then they start throwing anything and everything at it. And, I think what's surprising to people when they come and work for us at Apollo and they work and are mentored by me is they expect, because I don't know, maybe they've heard me speak or read some of my papers or something, they're expecting like this huge amount of intellectual behavior analysis to be dropped on them to fix their problems. And instead what they get is, let's carve this down to the simple elements. And what I find that often is not asked by young behavior analysts is, okay, we're going to use this protocol. Why? Why are you going to use that protocol? It's a simple question, but in my opinion, it's the most important question I constantly ask myself, my team, about everything we do. Why? I went into a clinic before the pandemic, and again, when I call, maybe I shouldn't even call them out. It was implemented. So I go in, and I won't even call out specific names. I go in, they're using a very popular behavior reduction protocol, and for every single client in the clinic. And it's pretty involved. It's not what I would call a tier 1, just general behavior management protocol. There's lots of moving parts to this particular protocol. And I went to the clinical director and I was like, I've noticed that you have every single client on this particular protocol. And she said, yes. I said, may I ask why? I was like, do you have data suggesting that this protocol is functionally appropriate for the behavior of every client in the clinic? And she looked at me like she didn't even know what I was asking and said, well, I went to Dr. So-and-so's talk in the workshop, and, I've listened to them on podcasts.
Uh-oh.
And it was just really, and I was like, okay, let's sit down and let's have a heart to heart. I'm not going to make you feel dumb. I'm not going to ridicule you. That's a great protocol when it's functionally appropriate. When it's not functionally appropriate, we should come back and ask ourselves why. And then when we've started with that, we've started with, maybe I just really liked the presenter I heard and I want to use those procedures. And then that procedure doesn't work for a client. Now, because my foundation was not initially set on a science-based approach, the solutions just become, well, I did this protocol with this client one time, so let's try that now. And so they'll go in, they'll spend hours making new materials, making new protocols, setting up new data collection systems in their EMR, just to see things get worse and worse. And it becomes a snowball. And one of the things that I do is say, okay, let's back it up. We just received in one of our clinics a client who's received 7 years of ABA from another provider. And the family, unfortunately, it took them 7 years to kind of get a belly full of the fact that their child was getting bigger and more aggressive and things were getting worse. And when we looked at the records, I was like, okay, we're going to need to throw all this out. We don't even need to do a behavior assessment right this second. Let's get this child on our tier 1 protocol, get some basic contingencies consistent and in place, try to build some stimulus control around compliance, and let's see what we're dealing with and go forward as if this is brand new. Because there was, it's almost akin to, we're all critical when we get patients who've maybe seen a psychiatrist and they're on 4 or 5 psychotropic medications. It's happening in our field where a kid will come to you and it's like, good gracious, you've got 5 or 6 different interventions all trying to reduce this problem behavior. And you don't understand how they interact with one another and how they change the contextual environment related to this client's behavior. And now we just have this big, monstrous, complex system moving forward. And there's nothing the behavior analyst is like, I don't know what to do now. Well, that's where we have to bring parsimony back to play. We have to try and slice away all the complexity and try to come back with a new, fresh, functional perspective of the client's behavior. And before we get into whole-scale investing into make all these materials, make all these protocols, let's just tinker with what we think might work. Let's just test run it, trial run it, whatever you want to call it. This great book that I was taught with in graduate school calls it Tinkering. Hayes, Barlow, and Nelson Gray. Tinkering with a protocol. And I love in that book how they talk about even after you've published data on a protocol, the critical analysis of those procedures should not stop. So really, in theory, everything we do, if we're true to our value of philosophical doubt, we should constantly try to make our procedures better, more efficient, more effective.
Okay, hang on. I want to get into the tinkering here in just a second, and I want to get into some specific examples of how you've implemented this.
Absolutely.
But you made a comment a second ago that I can't let go by without asking another question, and this is perhaps a little bit aside of what we plan to discuss, but hey, we're in the rabbit hole now. So So when you had that client show up with this very elaborate protocol with all sorts of different interventions stacked on top of one another, and it doesn't seem like it was it's one thing if all those things were in place and it was getting gangbusters results. It didn't seem I'm just kind of reading between the lines here that was not the case with this learner. And I'm asking you to go way out in the limb here, Jim, so bear with me. But how do you think that clinical repertoire gets shaped up? Obviously, we want that what ended up on a piece of paper and written in someone's treatment plan. It's the product of a learning history of a practitioner. And again, I know we're not going to tackle all the problems in applied behavior analysis in this short little conversation here, but I'm wondering. But you've obviously been around the block for a little bit. You're involved in we were chatting about some of the classes that you were teaching, and have taught over the years. Before we hit the record button, can you speculate about how a kid arrives on your doorstep in that state? I guess I'll just
I have very specific opinions about that. Some may not be as popular as others. I think number one, who taught your research evaluation course? And that doesn't mean that if they've got an arm full of JAB and Java publications that they're better than someone who doesn't. Do they understand, like if you're saying that your program is producing practitioners mainly, have they taught them a science-based approach using the tools of our field to apply? Because in my mind, research evaluation, if it's made into client-oriented research evaluation, is a great way to constantly evaluate the effectiveness of your whole program. What I'm finding is when I ask interviewees who are new BCBAs or soon-to-be new BCBAs, what do you feel like is the one course that was most lacking? Research evaluation is always what comes up. They feel like they don't even understand what our approach to clinical evaluation and research evaluation is, our idiographic approach. So we've got that one issue. I've also, and this second part is completely based off my observations and supervising graduate students. I think that when the model arose that allowed a student to maybe attend an online or a night class-based program and continue to work full-time as an RBT, obviously for the quality of life for that individual, that's a lot better than like folks like you and I encountered where we're like, eating ramen noodles late at night because we can't afford anything else because we're graduate students. So I think that's great. But what I've noticed is when I go in there and it's clear that a client needs a new protocol, and I'll kind of make that also a mentoring teaching moment for that student. I'll say, okay, this has happened dozens. It happened just yesterday. Say, what should we do next? And they'll throw out a protocol. I'll say, okay, why? And I get the same answer almost every time because I've used it with another client with similar behavior and it worked.
Okay. And
so now what I've seen is, and so we take great efforts at Apollo to really, we have a behavior analyst and training program where we really try to get them out of this full-time billing requirement so they can learn the problem-solving skills as a BCBA before they graduate. Because what I've noticed is, wow, if they're really good as an RBT, and most of our graduate students are outstanding RBTs, they have a history of running protocols. And if no one has specifically spoken with them about the why of this protocol, all they know is, motor stereotypy. I use RIRD, and it works most of the time. So it's almost like they were playing, based on their history, this topographical matching game. Here's the behavior. Oh, and this has worked for me in the past.
Yeah.
And it's like one of the worst ways to make decisions about what to do next.
Got it. All right. Well, thanks for indulging me on that. So let's get into some specific examples where you've used this process to get a better understanding of a case that wasn't going anywhere, or you can take that, I guess, in whatever direction you like.
So I think one of the most common uses of this approach, and again, what we're talking about is we've gone through, and I'd encourage the listeners who might not have heard the first episode to go back and review kind of all the rule outs we go through, like, do we have good attending? Do we have strong motivation? Do we have instructional control? All of those rule outs that we should consider first. Now we're at the step, okay, this isn't working. We have to try something else. Probably the most common situation that I'm in every day is the use of prompting and error correction in skill acquisition programs. There's actually not as much literature behind those two things as you would expect, given how much people do it every day. And so we published a paper in 2019 that looked specifically at two different protocols, comparing error correction procedures. For specifically, again, you have to ask the why. Why is what we initially designed not working? Well, in that 2019 paper, both of the participants had very poor attending and engaged in what I would call kind of pseudo guessing, and it can shape up scrolling, but especially in matching the sample arrays. And so we go in, we have a hypothesis that we have to do something to increase the attending of both of these individuals. So then we go to the literature, and we only found two studies that were real relevant to that. And Wayne Fisher, my mentor, was the first author on both of them. And Tiffany Kodak and I were on the first paper. In one paper, we used a differential observing response as kind of a prompt. Instead of using it as kind of an errorless teaching procedure, we would say, for example, touch red. And if they made an incorrect response, we would show them an identical stimulus, say, look, this is red, touch red. And now we've made it like an identity matching task, with the whole hypothesis being, if we can increase their attending, fade the prompt out, we'll get acquisition. Well, we found that in our 2007 paper. So we had that protocol that seemed to match the same functional properties of the errors these clients were making. Well, Wayne also published a study in, I think, 2014 or 2015, increasing the saliency of consequences in skill acquisition programs, where he used second-order reinforcement schedules and response costs. So basically, the child had edible tokens, so gummies, and on an FR, the delivery of a gummy was on an FR1, so that was one part of the second-order schedule. But to consume those tokens, they had to get 3 in a row. So it's an FR3 with an FR1. At any time, if the child made an error, there was a response cost procedure that removed all of the tokens. And so that was the more recent. It was a very popular paper. And when we sat down and we kind of scrutinized this, we said, okay, we kind of have both of these things going down. Let's try both with both kids and see what happens. And so we started to tinker, meaning we're using that qualitative experimental approach that I talked about in episode 1. So we're really more taking notes about how the child responds than getting lost in that moment with developing the data collection system and then the measurement methodology. We're going to systematically manipulate our independent variable, our treatment variables, and we're going to quickly see how does the child initially respond. And what we found initially was, wow, it seems like either one of them might yield productivity. So we made the decision to put those two in an alternating treatments design and make a comparison that maybe we could publish. And when we did that, we found that the differential observing response was superior. I spend a lot of time looking at and tinkering with error correction procedures. I was in a session last week, and when you start using RFT programming and you're now trying to develop this speaker as listener repertoire, you have to think differently about your error correction, your prompting. So we had this child, pretty verbally sophisticated. He is on an arbitrary coordination program. So it's, it's the context of sameness, but with arbitrary stimuli, like a printed word to a picture, which aren't really the same, but through our socially mediated consequences, we say they're the same, like the printed word Pooh Bear and the picture of Pooh Bear. And so we had an array of Pooh Bear, Piglet, and Eeyore, and the printed word Pooh Bear. And the child kept, even though we had trained it picture to word, when we flipped it around and now we had other pictures in the array, the child kept picking Piglet. And the BCBA started to get really, really frustrated. And I said, hold on, why don't you just ask him why he keeps picking that? And she looked at me initially like I had violated some orthodoxy from the behavior analyst, sacred documents. And what? I said, ask him why he keeps picking that. And so she said, okay, why do you keep picking that? Because Piglet always says Pooh Bear. It's like, okay, so we have some previous history now interfering with the derived relation. So I said, now let's just try this. So I went back through, I got in there, I said, let me try this. So I flipped it back to the original relation. So originally the picture to the printed words. And so he got that every single time. And I was like, okay, so right now these are the same. So let's forget about Piglet saying Pooh Bear. And based on what we just did, I flipped it around, now which would you say is the same? Well, he immediately picked Pooh Bear. He goes, well, you could have just told me that that's what we were doing. And it was an example. And the BCBA even said to me, oh, thank goodness I didn't get into a whole process of writing protocols and trying to figure out definitions. And, because the truth is once we got past that little barrier, we didn't have to change the protocol. We just needed, so for him, the one modification that was made was if he made an error on a test of deriving, we simply asked him, well, why did you choose that one? And then we got our answer from the client. And that client has since discharged. It's one of the shortest admission to discharge cases I've ever been involved with. We started with him in January, and he's now discharged into a kindergarten general ed classroom. And so those types of things I can think of. Another often thing that you have to tinker around with is their attending and orienting behavior. Every kid, attending and motivation are so closely tied together that you really need to spend some time, again, from a qualitative experimental perspective, trying to figure out the best way this client will increase their attending if you use tier 1 procedures like we do. If those procedures are ineffective, figuring out why, and then test running it, tinkering with it. Maybe in that moment you see, I think it's like, when graduate students do a thesis, I feel sorry for the ones that are not told, hey, before you even propose, let's go out and find a test case. Let's run a test case of this. And when you do that, you learn, you save yourself the problem of, oh, I wouldn't have known that this data collection system wasn't appropriate if I'd not tested it out. Oh, I need to tweak my definition. But if I do that on the front end, I can write a definition at that point that's going to be better. I'm going to come up with a more sensitive measurement system, and procedurally, I'm going to chop away a lot of the fluff that's unneeded and have a very elegant, parsimonious, efficient protocol.
I see. It kind of, again, harkens back to a number of episodes in which we've discussed these things, not just the first case study series, but also the making science part of your practice episode we did before we started the Apollo
so this
series.
is kind of like the follow-up to that, to say, here is, now you've done all these rule outs, now something has got to change. And I think we've also talked in an earlier episode about functional analysis. In my opinion, this approach is most needed before you expose a child to any kind of extended analysis. Is just go in there and say, I'll often say, hey, we had a child that was engaging in elopement and stripping behavior several months ago. And I went in and said, okay, for these next couple of minutes, write down everything you see, and I am going to manipulate this. I'm going to do this. And sometimes it might be an isolated contingency, kind of a la Dr. Awada, and sometimes it might be multiple contingencies that would make our friend Dr. Hanley happier. It's whatever is most appropriate for the child, but spending a brief period of time, and I'm not talking about hours, I'm talking about 20 to 30 minutes, interacting yourself with the behavior, not getting, if we all harken back to when we learned about quality of measurement in graduate school and all the things that can affect an observer. Well, if I get tied up too much on the front end, just trying to figure out my measurement system, and I don't know that my manipulations might yield what I'm hoping, I've wasted a lot of time and probably produced useless data. But when I just spend, sometimes it's 5 minutes, sometimes it's 30 minutes, just tinkering around. And if you have good collaboration with your team, and usually when I tinker with a client's behavior, we start getting a crowd building up around because everyone wants to see. But when you have that, and you have good trust and good collaboration on your team, somebody else may say, hey, did y'all notice that the client did this when Dr. Moore did that? And maybe I even missed it. I was like, okay, so now let's take all these notes and let's think critically about it. Let's try to figure out exactly what's going on and what might be the best procedure. And that 5 to 30 minute investment, in my experience, saves us so much time in the long run.
Yeah. I can think to a lot of situations in schools where I might have done something on a smaller scale, but similar to that, where you're not running any type of elaborately planned functional analysis, but you're trying to interact strategically and purposefully with an individual to note how they respond to those interactions. So
I think that's a great point. I think it's a great point, because I think the listeners, if they're trying or if they have run functional analysis in their practice, that word that you just said, elaborate, are they thinking, okay, we need to run a functional analysis? And is it 2 weeks later before you actually get to it? Is it, how much time are you spending? We had a case not too long ago. In fact, the episode I recorded that I had to do out of my car because of internet problems.
Oh, yeah.
We had run an analysis. We had a child that had automatically reinforced motor stereotypy that was interfering with skill acquisition programs. And so I spent about 10 minutes in the room with him, kind of almost taking a Linda LeBlanc competing items approach to what I was seeing. And I was like, okay, clean the room out. And every couple of minutes, I want to change materials just to see which one of these items might best compete with this automatically reinforced motor stereotypy. And so in 10 minutes, it was very crystal clear to my team, here's what we need to do to capture this in a functional analysis. And then we spend the next 30 minutes right there in the moment. We define behaviors, define the conditions. And we said one difference that we don't have is no analysis has ever been done to demonstrate that this is automatically reinforcing, that this behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement. So in the moment, we said, okay, let's demonstrate that and demonstrate what items might compete with that. Let's go ahead and hypothesize that this behavior is automatically reinforced, but when we implement our procedures, let's verify that. So we just did a simple multi-element where we alternated ignore conditions with basically ignore plus an item. And we measured the child's level of stereotypy and item engagement. And what we found is, yes, he had a pretty strong, stable, automatically reinforced level of stereotypy. And then we found, after we went through about 10 items, okay, here are 4 that seemed to significantly cut into that other. The ATD gave us a great comparison to where items would not compete with it versus the ones that would. And I said, okay, so now what we need to do is move forward and use some signaling to let this client know that we're going to work, and you're going to get to work for your choice of one of these 4 items. And within a day, we now had a child who was not getting any work done, now sitting motivated at the table, engaging in skill acquisition, to where now, I think that was a year ago, actually. Now, instead of us having to talk to his parents about what are we going to do with his stripping and elopement and motor stereotypy and all these other behaviors, we're getting to see all this awesome progress he's making from a skill acquisition standpoint. We could have easily spent weeks. I've seen clinics that would have spent weeks trying to analyze and solve that problem. And we spent less than a day and got the child moving in the right direction.
I think that's an outcome a lot of listeners can get behind. So I appreciate you running through that example.
Well, it's kind of like Greg always says. I really agree when I hear Greg Hanley talk about, in today's ABA, we have to balance effectiveness with efficiency. I learned early in my career from some great behavior analysts all about effectiveness. But sometimes our effectiveness gets the scales out of kilter where we're not very efficient, and then it becomes harder and harder to justify paying for those services. So we do have to find that balance. And I really believe that this approach that we've talked about now a few times is a highly efficient approach and consistent with the scientific foundations of our field.
Great. So I have to imagine there are people listening to this, Jim, who want to maybe take a deeper dive into this topic area. So I've got my notes here. I've kind of scrawled down a bunch of different titles and things like that, and I'll circle back to some of those papers that you referenced with you, and I'll get those in the show notes. But just more generally, are there resources that you would recommend for folks to look into if they want to, if they're really responding to what you're saying here and want to learn more about how to look at things through this particular lens?
Well, to bring it back up.
Yeah. So let's get, so the scientist practitioner.
I think that there's an even newer version. This is the second edition. I have the first edition somewhere in a box somewhere, but this particular edition came out in 1999. And why I think it's still relevant today is it just doesn't talk about good database problem solving. Is if you see the subtitle is research and accountability in the age of managed care. This book, though it's not a perfect prediction of our insurance billing reality now, there's so many sections where it's like, wow, they're really foretelling what we're practicing under now, where we can't just do these elaborate analyses that are unending and roll on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Is there has to be some accountability. So this book is a great resource. I can drop to you.
Yeah, I'll look up the Amazon link and have that in the show notes. So, and we can run down the studies that you cited offline as well. If you're
share those as well.
If you're out there riding around your car, walking your dog, you're on the treadmill or whatever, don't worry. Go to behavioralobservations.com and look for this episode, and we'll have the show notes there waiting for you. So, all right, Jim. Well, I'm glad we were able to come back from our brief hiatus in the case study series. So, thanks so much for joining me again. This has been a lot of fun.
It has been. And again, as always, if folks I've really appreciated the questions that folks have sent to me. My email is jim.moore@apollobehavior.com. I would love to answer your questions, or if you just want to have a discussion about any of these things. I can't always promise that I respond quickly, but I do respond. You can also contact me on LinkedIn. A lot of people will message me about the podcast on LinkedIn. I really appreciate that. So feel free to reach out, and even if it's just to say hi.
Yeah. And you've had a few thought-provoking posts on LinkedIn as of late. I won't. We'll just leave that as for people to go check out. So, all right, Jim. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.